Well, hello. Hello to everyone watching, wherever in the world you may be. My name is Michael Kugelman. I'm the Senior Associate for South Asia and the Deputy Director for the Asia Program at the Woodrow Wilson Center. This is the second online video event that the Asia Program has produced since the Wilson Center transitioned to remote operations several weeks back. These products take a whole lot of effort. So right off the bat, I'd like to thank my colleague, John Tyler, and his team with the Wilson Center multimedia staff. I also want to thank the Wilson Center's Middle East program, the institutional co-sponsor for this event today. And finally, I want to recognize Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, our external partner for this event. We work very closely with RFE-RL through the AFPAC file, which is our jointly produced podcast series on Afghanistan and Pakistan that comes out every other week. The latest episode focuses on the impacts of coronavirus in both Afghanistan and Pakistan. The coronavirus pandemic has really dominated everything over the last few weeks, and for very good reason, for sure. But even as the news cycle has understandably been fixated on the pandemic, the world continues to turn, and there are other major developments out there as well. And one of them is the Afghan peace and reconciliation process. So let me just take a few quick moments to review recent developments on this front. 1 month ago, after well more than a year of difficult negotiations, which featured multiple rounds of talks and even a brief cancellation of talks, the US and the Taliban reached an agreement. The deal, which was signed on February 29th in Doha, set out a schedule for a phased US troop withdrawal with the expectation that the Taliban make counterterrorism commitments and begin formal peace talks within an intra-Afghan dialogue after just a period of some days. The US-Taliban deal arguably represented and still represents, in my view, the best chance yet to end a US-led war that has raged on for nearly 19 years. And yet, over the last few weeks, multiple obstacles have precluded the launch of that intra-Afghan dialogue. One of these obstacles is a plan laid out in the US-Taliban agreement, an agreement negotiated without Kabul's involvement, for up to 5,000 Taliban prisoners to be released before peace talks begin. Kabul, however, said that it would only release them gradually, whereas the Taliban said that all 5,000 had to be freed before it starts the intra-Afghan dialogue. There has also been a very long and complex political spat between Afghan President Ashraf Ghani and his main rival, Abdullah. Abdullah not only rejected presidential election results in February that had ruled Ghani the winner, but he also declared himself president and gave himself a presidential inauguration on the same day as Ghani's. And this spat had prevented the Afghan government from putting together a negotiating team for talks with the Taliban. And it was in fact this spat between Ghani and Abdullah that prompted Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, in the throes of the coronavirus pandemic, to get on a plane and make the long trip to Kabul for a surprise visit a week ago. He failed to end that political stalemate, and he then announced a $1 billion aid cut to Afghanistan. Recent days, however, have brought some possible rays of light, and I emphasize the word possible. First off, the Taliban and Afghan government negotiators have spoken online in recent days and agreed on some type of arrangement that could soon lead to the release of some Taliban prisoners. And also, even though the Ghani-Abdullah spat has not been resolved, the Afghan government did finalize a list of negotiators to be involved in talks with the Taliban. However, the Taliban has rejected that list. But at any rate, we are seeing some possible forward movement on peace and reconciliation, but it's very slow going. And of course, now with the coronavirus very much entrenched in Afghanistan, the question is whether an Afghan state that is capacity constrained and resource strapped under the best of circumstances will have the bandwidth to maintain its focus on peace talks when faced with such a serious national crisis. So some key questions that emerge from all this are: where do things stand with peace and reconciliation in Afghanistan? Where might things be going? How can the main obstacles be addressed? What could coronavirus mean for all of this? And what role should the US play? We've got a terrific panel with us today to address these issues and others. And I want to thank all four of our speakers, terrific speakers, for joining us. I will introduce them, though very briefly, as I believe you should all be able to see their biographical information on your screen. If you scroll down just a bit, I'll introduce them in the order that they will speak. First, Sami Mahdi is the Kabul Bureau Chief of Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty's Afghan service, locally known as Radio Azadi. He also teaches at Kabul University. He's previously held a series of senior positions with Afghan media outlets, and he's a former recipient of the Knight International Journalism Award from the International Center for Journalists. Second, we have with us Dr. Nilafar Sakai, who is professorial lecturer in international affairs at George Washington University. She previously taught at George Mason University. Her regional expertise is South Asia, Afghanistan, but also Iran. She's been involved in Afghan peace process issues for a decade, and she remains a regular commentator and writer on peacemaking and peace building in Afghanistan. Ashley Jackson is a research associate with the Overseas Development Institute, a London-based think tank. She has conducted dialogue with and research on 27 armed factions, including the Afghan Taliban. She was recently based in Afghanistan conducting doctoral research on how the Taliban governs and provides basic services in areas it controls, and she just very recently successfully defended her dissertation, so congratulations on that. And finally, Laurel Miller is Asia Program Director at the International Crisis Group. She was previously a senior foreign policy expert at the RAND Corporation. From 2013 to 2017, she was the deputy and then the acting special representative for Afghanistan and Pakistan at the US State Department. And she previously held a number of senior US government positions, including senior advisor to the US Special Envoy for the Balkans. So again, it's a terrific panel. The format will be, we'll hear very brief opening comments from each panelist. I may then ask a few questions to the group, and then we'll go to a Q&A with questions from you all from Twitter and email. So please, if you have a question, tweet it to the Asia Program's Twitter handle, which is @AsiaProgram, all one word. Or you could email your question to asia@wilsoncenter, all one word, .org. And please feel free to live tweet this debate. We always are happy when that happens. So with that, no one tuned into this webcast to hear me talk. Everyone tuned in to hear from our four experts today. So with that, let's get started. So first we will go to Kabul. And Sami, why don't you get us started off?
Thank you so much, Michael, for this introduction, and I'm very glad to be here. I think, as you put it very rightly, Afghanistan is facing at the same time three major crises. The first one is the deadlock in the negotiations with the Taliban. The second is the political crisis between two main rivals, Dr. Abdullah and President Ashraf Ghani. And the third one is the coronavirus. About the first one, as we speak, in the 24 hours, in the last 24 hours, 28 soldiers were killed by the Taliban. It means there is no reduction in violence. Taliban are still attacking the Afghan National Security and Defense Forces. And at the same time, we see attacks claimed by other groups such as ISIS, the tragic attack which happened this week, at the beginning of this week, in Kabul at the one of these dharamsalas, a Sikh temple. Yesterday, a group of Taliban delegation met virtually, through Skype or maybe Zoom, with the Afghan government to talk the technicalities of releasing about 5,000 Taliban prisoners in the Afghan prisons. But they didn't reach any kind of agreement. They were supposed to, the Afghan government had promised to release about 100 Taliban prisoners by March 31st. But as they announced today, they didn't reach any agreement, so it has been postponed once again. As you mentioned, the Afghan government was not part of a party to the deal made between the Taliban and the United States. Therefore, the Afghan government has had its own, point of view about to release or not to release the prisoners, and they are saying the prisoner release should be an outcome of the negotiations, not at the beginning of the negotiations. The second thing is the political crisis after the elections, as you mentioned. Dr. Abdullah has announced himself as the president, a rival president to President Ashraf Ghani on the same day, on the same time, and it hasn't been resolved. Even Secretary Pompeo, when he came to Kabul, he couldn't resolve it, and he decided to cut $1 billion in aid to Afghanistan. Now, former President Karzai and Sayyaf and some other prominent political figures are trying to resolve the tensions between Ghani and Abdullah. Last night, there was a meeting between former President Karzai, Sayyaf, Qanuni, Khalili, and Abdullah. And they have been trying to talk to President Ghani as well, but as I am aware, they haven't been able to talk to him yet. And at the same time, this coronavirus crisis in Afghanistan is becoming every day, day by day measure. I mean, thousands of Afghan immigrants are returning back from Iran. And as you know, Iran is one of most affected countries by coronavirus. And yesterday we learned that 50 Afghan refugees were dead in Iran. And since people do not trust the public health sector here in Afghanistan much, and the public health sector doesn't have much facilities, therefore the numbers and data released by the public health ministry is not trusted by the public. So the numbers that they give to the public is around 150 positive cases in Afghanistan with 4 deaths. More than 100 cases are in Herat only. So the government is stretched between the deadlock in the negotiations with the Taliban, the political crisis, as well as the coronavirus.
Well, thank you very much, Semi, for that. For those opening comments. It sets a rather somber and challenging tone, but also a realistic one, which we appreciate. Thank you for that. So let's now go over to Niloufar and hear your opening comments.
Thank you, Michael, for having me here. But I have been following closely the impact of all these facts that Sami also mentioned on the general population and what it means to a comprehensive peace and reconciliation of Afghanistan. March 9th, with the inauguration of a parallel government, the divide between President Ghani and the opposition figures, increased violence across Afghanistan, and also the COVID-19. I think these are the 4 major factors and updates from last almost couple of months that we are facing, and that had a huge impact on the population in large. And as I mentioned previously, Michael, about the bottom-top approaches and how that could complement the top-level approaches of peace processes, that's an important element to be considered, especially if there will be an accord to made, who is going to legitimize and how the population in large will support that accord, if there will be any. So my whole focus has been to look really at that, the possibility of that particular population, non-state actors involved, and how they perceive these factors and how they perceive this major dynamics which is happening throughout the process. So overall, what I have been following, it is unfortunately a negative and pessimist view which is spread around the country on the peace process in general. Yes, I agree with what you have highlighted as a couple of positive updates we have from last 2 weeks almost. But overall, as I mentioned, these 4 factors have influenced the general mood of the population in relation to the peace process. And it's considered, which many of us have feared from the beginning, that it should not be considered an elite-based political process, which actually it is turning to be an elite-based political process rather than a comprehensive peace process, which all of us has been pushing a lot. So that element is fading away. That the second element, that people's element, the population in large, that element is fading away because of this dynamism which is coming up, and it is shrinking. The process is shrinking to be confined to only a specific, very focused, elite-based, top-level approach, which is losing its attraction and confidence and trust among the population. So this is worrisome for me, because for any peace processes to be enforced and to be sustainable and at least with a possible result, we need that confidence and trust to be built. I totally understand that we haven't reached to that level to have to start with the comprehensiveness of the process, but these factors can influence the result in general, which my concern is about. The COVID-19 has certainly undermined the entire process, which all of us are quite aware about that. People are more concerned about their socioeconomic life rather than the political life. And poverty is spreading, human insecurity, health insecurity in generally are major concern, economic security. So physical security has all right, that's a major element still, but people are really, really concerned about the other elements which is impacting their socioeconomic life, and it itself undermine the peace process both across the country, starting from Kabul to the provinces. And as I mentioned, and Sami also mentioned about the increased violence across the country. I mean, the number of attacks across the country on different provinces, that has undermined the notion of reduction in violence. And that's another factor which has influenced people's perception about the outcome of the process. There's a lack of trust now that if Taliban are not standing on a basic terms of this particular agreement, which was reduction in violence, then how they will trust the process in general, how they will trust any future agreement which has to be made. And this level of violence has really changed overall the perception recently.
Well, thank you very much, Nilüfer, for those very thoughtful comments. Nilüfer is joining us from DC. Sami is joining us from Kabul. Let's now go to Ashley, who is in Oslo. Take it away.
Thanks, Michael. You had asked me to speak to the Taliban side of things, how the Taliban's reacting, what their strategy is within all of this. And I think the sort of 3 core issues that Sami outlined are the right ones. So I'm going to kind of pick up where he left off, looking at how the Taliban has dealt with the domestic crises, both health and political, that Afghanistan is experiencing, and how they're reacting to the unexpected hurdles and challenges in moving the peace process forward. And certainly they're playing a role in that as well. But just to start with the domestic political crisis, the Taliban strategy to date has been partly to sit back and to watch elites in Kabul tear each other apart. As Sami pointed out, the electoral uncertainty has been going on for months now, and even with this impending health catastrophe in the form of COVID, these elites still can't get it together. And I think that's maddening and frustrating for many Afghans. But the point is, the Taliban at least perceives that it benefits from these optics of dysfunction and disunity. It also benefits from the optics of how the US has reacted to this domestic political crisis. As you pointed out, Michael, Secretary Pompeo visited Kabul last week, and it's a prime example of how the sort of visual plays out. You have this image of Pompeo visiting Kabul, slashing $1 billion in aid, releasing an incredibly harsh statement about the disappointment over the crisis, and then immediately flying to Doha to meet with Mullah Baradar, which is strangely giving the appearance somehow of the US being more able to work with the Taliban or more able to deal with them, which is extraordinary in terms of optics. Of course, the reality is certainly more complex and more nuanced than that. But I think you do see the Taliban kind of benefiting from that domestic political crisis. And then, of course, you have the health crisis, or, I mean, it's not necessarily a crisis yet, or at the magnitude to which we foresee it becoming a crisis. I think there's a widespread concern, and you led with this, that the health crisis will supersede everything else, the peace process, everything else. It is certainly hard to see how intra-Afghan talks will move forward as originally envisioned, even a couple of weeks ago. But that said, a health crisis like this can also be an opportunity diplomatically, right? It could be an opportunity for all sides to come together on something apolitical, establish a humanitarian dialogue that acts as not only something that solves an actual crisis, but acts as a confidence building measure and keeps the dialogue going, at least on this issue. And certainly all Afghans would benefit from that as well. And this is frankly what I would be pushing for were I to have my way about what happens next. It doesn't seem to be happening yet, right? At least not that we can see from the outside. The Taliban has, of course, refused calls for a ceasefire more broadly. Specific to COVID, they've taken some action. Some of it seems to be strategic communication. Some of it seems to be putting some measures in place in areas that they control. It's sort of tough to tell how much of this is propaganda or how much of it is real. But the one thing that they could do, which is reduce fighting, they certainly haven't done that. Which brings me to sort of the last big issue that Sammy raised, and that was the nascent political process to end the war. And of course, after the violence reduction, the Taliban has gone back to the status quo of 20, 22, 24 incidents a day. They took a district center in Badakhshan last night. They're holding back on attacking the US, it seems. But it's an interesting calculation they're making. There's been a high degree of strategic ambiguity around expectations that the Taliban would reduce violence, right? And the Taliban seems to have correctly calculated how much violence they can actually get away with, which is to say they can get away with a pretty high level of violence. They've essentially gone back to normal. But what I'm really interested to watch over the next few weeks is what happens with the spring offensive. And the Taliban, sometime after Nowruz, so sometime around now, over the next month or two, they should theoretically announce this annual spring offensive. And that's a military operation which usually kicks off with a couple of high-profile attacks and an uptick in violence, right? But there's also a statement, a policy statement, which is very directional in terms of what their priorities are, what their main target is, which I think will be very interesting to see how they balance that with ostensibly being somehow on board with a peace process, ostensibly wanting to combat COVID and have Afghans' health and safety in mind, and all of the other political and military imperatives. So I think that will be an interesting moment to watch, presuming they announce an offensive at all, which, I mean, I do expect them to do. It would be highly unusual were they to not do that. But just to touch on some of the other points raised about the nascent peace process, the one thing that I find very interesting is that consistently the US has been portrayed as being in a hurry, and the Taliban has been portrayed as being not in a hurry at all. And with the domestic political crisis, with the health crisis, that is, beyond everyone's control, that's slowing things down, right? It's putting a damper on whatever momentum there might have been and making it incredibly challenging to move forward as planned. I mean, we've talked about the prisoner exchange and the negotiating teams. Those are moving slowly forward for reasons that probably have those delays aren't necessarily due to they're due to a number of factors, let's just say. But what I think is kind of interesting is we're very much behind on the timeline. We're very much behind on what was originally planned and envisioned. But, we talked about there being Skype meetings. I touched on humanitarian dialogue. The question now, I guess, is how will the US creatively use some of the challenges to transform and keep things going? And I think the other question with that is how will the Taliban also use some of those obstacles to sort of get what they want and to maneuver? The pieces on the chessboard are kind of moving around. The dynamics are changing. So, I mean, I'll leave it there, but I think there's as much to be skeptical about as there is to be optimistic about. I mean, we talked about Skype meetings, but maybe that's a way to keep people talking. It sounds incredibly prosaic to most of us who, spend our lives on Skype, but maybe that's a more informal way of building confidence, of talking about things. So I'll leave it there on what, the best I can muster in terms of optimism.
Well, thank you very much, Ashley. And indeed, any opportunity to talk about some type of optimistic angle is always useful in this regard. Thank you for those comments. Now let's turn things over to Laurel.
Thank you. So I've been asked to say a bit about what the U.S. should do now. And by now, I'm going to focus a little bit less on overcoming the very immediate hurdles and more on what I think it is the U.S. should do if the immediate hurdles are overcome and there is an opportunity to regenerate some momentum in the peace process. Those immediate hurdles, of course, being what Sami and Ashley primarily focused on, the political wrangling in Kabul over both the question of the presidency and the formation of a negotiating team, and then the challenges presented by the negotiation over prisoners. Those are the immediate obstacles to getting the process going. I see that COVID is a little bit different in the sense that that's not something that is approachable through diplomatic initiatives. That's a factor that's just, it's going to have to play into how much priority is attended to the peace process and also what the mechanisms are by which the process could move forward. For getting over these very immediate obstacles, I think the US is probably doing what it can do in exerting its leverage behind the scenes and trying to facilitate the dialogue between the Taliban and the Afghan government on the prisoners issues, working together with other international partners on that. But more importantly, I think, are the questions, or at least what there's more to say about, are the questions of what the US should do if these immediate obstacles are overcome. And I'll point to 5 things that I think the US should do. The first one is, I believe very strongly that the US should get behind the appointment of an empowered mediator, a neutral mediator. I don't think that the US is in a position to provide that mediating itself. I don't think that a relatively weak technocratic facilitator will do what is necessary in trying to move this process forward. And I think, in fact, the reasons why some who should be, in my view, behind this initiative, not only in the US, oppose it, is because there are multiple actors who want to leave open space for themselves to jockey to be in dominant control of the process. In a situation with the relative power dynamics being what they are in Afghanistan, I don't think there's any one party among the combatants who's in a position to play the dominant role in managing the peace process. This is not a, for instance, Colombia situation. That is not an apt analogy for the situation in an Afghan peace process. And to my mind, I think not having an empowered negotiator is a recipe for a rather chaotic process, and one that has a great deal of difficulty moving forward. I also don't think there's any realistic possibility of there being an empowered mediator unless the US is behind it. No government or institution is going to try to or be able to push themselves forward into that role unless the US is backing that. And I would say a couple of additional reasons why the US should not leave the field, but move itself a bit more into the background in this next phase of the process, or that it's going to continue to be necessary, unfortunately, for the US to play a role in managing disputes among the various individuals and groups on the Kabul side of the table. And it would be very difficult for the US to play both the role of mediating and facilitating among those on the Kabul side of the table and between that side of the table and the Taliban at the same time as being an interested party itself. I also think that, and here's a reason why the US is probably not going to heed my advice on this. I think that this being a presidential election year in the United States means that if the US is playing too dominant a role in the peace process, it is going to be pushing for things that are in the interests of the United States from a political perspective rather than in the interests of what is going to make for a good peace process and a good outcome. I mean, I'm not saying the US won't be interested in the peace process and the outcome and will be purely political about it, but there will undoubtedly, and this is not a criticism of any person, it's just the way the world works, it is undoubted that the US will apply a political lens to its involvement in the process and what it tries to push and how fast it tries to push. A second point is that I think the US should ask another government to take the lead in establishing a group of regional countries and maybe a region plus others group as well to provide essential coordination for support for an Afghan peace process. And by support, I mean in the first instance, political support for pushing it along, and then later other forms of more material support too. A lot of people have talked about this, the so-called regional dimension and the need for the regional countries to be on board. You need to have mechanisms for doing that, for rallying these countries around some principles and coordination. And you need a format and a forum, and not just occasional ad hoc kind of meetings to do this. There are a lot of other examples of this in other peace processes around the world. I think there's just too much on the US plate to be able to do that effectively, in addition to the other roles that the US is playing. Moreover, obviously, Iran and China are essential participants in any kind of regional support group. And obviously, US relations with both Iran and China are, shall we say, not at their best at the moment. So another government would be in a better position to create a group that the US should also be a part of, but isn't the leading force in. A third point is it's crucial that the US be realistic about the timeline for how long a peace process may take, if it's a real peace process, and to be patient. And some of the statements by US officials about their ambitions for how quickly this next phase could go are, I think, setting expectations that are not realistic and therefore not helpful. I mean, I can imagine why US officials would not want to say, oh, this is going to take a year or 2 years or 3 years. That's fine. But stating very unrealistic, very short timeframes, I think is unhelpful as a signal to others and as a signal of what the US expectations and staying power are. A fourth point is that I think the US could be very helpful in working with the parties on both sides themselves, as well as with other international partners and a mediator, if there is one, in in establishing a structure for the peace process. At the moment, there is no evident structure for something that, if these other issues, such as the prisoners, weren't standing in the way, we would have thought might start in a week or 2 weeks. Of course, it's important that any structure be flexible. I'm not suggesting that you artificially set up something very rigid and unchanging. Any structure can evolve during the course of the peace process, but it's also important that it not be too loose. A very loose process combined with the lack of a mediator, but even with a mediator, becomes very hard to manage and can easily disintegrate into no process at all. At the moment, as I said, there's really no apparent structure or understanding of what the structure should be. The idea that you get 21 people on each side to just sit face to face throughout the duration of the process is obviously unrealistic in comparison to any other peace process we've seen around the world. So if it's not that, what is it going to be? And of course, if this does move into some kind of virtual meeting via Skype or Zoom, which I hope it doesn't, I think that will be even harder to manage, because I think it then becomes quite stilted and leaves little room for the sort of personal connections and side discussions that have proven crucial in other peace processes around the world. It's important, I think, for the US to recognize, and I hope they do, and they probably do, that this next phase is going to be much more complex than the phase of US Taliban talks, given the greater number of actors involved, interests involved, both internally among Afghans, but also externally among the other countries in the region. The final and fifth point here is, I think it's important, and this is a message not only to the US, but I was asked to speak to what the US should be doing, but for others as well. It's important not to be short-sighted in ambitions as to what kind of result one wants to achieve through a peace process. There has to be a balance between the comprehensiveness of the outcome of a peace process and the feasibility of getting to that result in a period of time that can be sustained. But there's a lot of space within that balance. I think it's quite risky, in my view, to aim for a very limited deal that sets up just an interim government and doesn't try to resolve any of the more fundamental questions. I think a deal like that would be very weak and at very high risk of falling apart quite quickly. And there has been some discussion about that kind of outcome for a peace process, with pushing all the more substantive issues later down the road. Again, I do agree you don't want to overload the process, but on the other hand, being insufficiently ambitious puts the process at risk of producing a result that just cannot be realistically implemented and sustained. And of course, Afghanistan has its own negative history with these kinds of agreements, the Bonn Agreement notwithstanding. I would just add a couple of very quick points in addition to these 5 main points, and maybe they're ones that we can discuss a little more in the question and answer. One is the ongoing violence that has been referenced by the other speakers. I think it's unfortunate that the US and others had set expectations for what the levels of violence would be during the peace process that are probably unrealistic. And although I obviously would greatly advocate for a ceasefire at this stage, or at least a lower level of violence than we're currently seeing, I think there also needs to be some realism about the likelihood of that. I don't think it's likely, and I think that it's important to moderate expectations about what the levels of violence will be in order to not lose the chance of having a peace process. And again, there are many ways to refer to international experience with this in other contexts. And then finally, and this is keying off of the point that Ashley made about the Taliban, seeing advantage in the political squabbling in Kabul and how this reinforces their narrative. I think it's quite important for all sides to realize that an ineffective negotiator on the other side of the table is not an advantage. You don't get to the end result of a peace process if your interlocutor on the other side of the table doesn't have clear positions and isn't able to negotiate effectively for either practical technical reasons or for political reasons. And so, if this process gets going and the parties on all sides begin to see that they have something at stake in its success, I hope, and I would certainly recommend that they come to see that ensuring that doing what they can to enable those on the other side of the table to negotiate effectively, to sell the results of the deal, is as much in their own interests as it is in the interests of their opponents.
Well, thank you very much, Laurel, for those great points. Very useful policy recommendations for the U.S. government as well. Thank you for that. Thank you all for those opening comments. I'd like to now get into a discussion and pose some questions to the panel. Just a reminder to all of you watching and listening, if you have a question for the panelists, please tweet the question to our Asia Program Twitter handle, which is @AsiaProgram, or send an email to asia@wilsoncenter.org, and your question will be conveyed to me, and I'll try to get to as many as I can in our time left. But first, I wanted to start the discussion with a few questions. First, sort of immediate term questions, then I'll sort of zoom out a bit and pose a few more long-range questions. The first question, which I would pose to all four of you, whoever wants to jump in, as we discussed, we have had some possible small, tiny steps forward in recent days, or we thought we've had that with prison release issue. You have a list of negotiators for the intra-Afghan dialogue that the government has got in Afghanistan has put out, even though the Taliban has rejected that list. But my question is a broader one, that to me, it seems like the real big obstacle here is the Ghani-Abdullah problem, or the Ghani-Abdullah crisis. My question is, can we actually realistically move forward with some type of intra-Afghan dialogue so long as that spat remains in place? And so in other words, how far can this fledgling, and I emphasize the word fledgling, peace process go so long as you have this political crisis? To me, it just seems very tough to think that you could somehow shoehorn two parallel governments into a intra-Afghan dialogue. So would welcome your thoughts on how important it is to resolve this political stalemate before we can actually move forward, or can we actually move forward even with this crisis? So anyone like to start?
I can have some comments on this.
Please.
Well, I actually think that there's the division between the political elites in Kabul, especially the divide between President Ghani and Abdullah, has already damaged the process, and it's if it continues, I don't think that the peace process will have any positive result, or even the process will be affected tremendously. Two reasons for this. First, because yes, we have a list of 25 individuals going for intra-Afghan talks. I think the list is comprehensive at this point, though from peacemaking perspective, there are two issues to be clarified: the procedural arrangement of these talks and the substantive issues of the talks. The procedural arrangement is the decision-making structure and how actually the entire process will take shape. If there will be a talk about the constitution reform, who will take that the amendment and review of the constitution forward, who will implement it, who will reform it? So there are procedural arrangement that I think relates to the negotiation, intra-Afghan negotiation, that has to be tackled. And how it's going to be tackled at this stage, we don't have any idea. First, because of the divide which is right now between these two political leaders is happening. The second is the substantive issues that has to be tackled by this negotiation team. And substantive issues are we have three major things that has to be discussed during the intra-Afghan talks. The first is the organization of the state. The second is the basic rights of individuals and people. And the third is the prospect for the Afghanistan foreign policy. There are three major issues that has to be tackled in as a substantive issues in the intra-Afghan dialogue. So now, these two political leaders have different views about these issues, and that will create a problem. That will create a hurdle when even there's no consensus on the issues to be discussed in intra-Afghan dialogue. So until and unless this division is not resolved, I think there won't be a consistent plan on the major substantive issues to be discussed in intra-Afghan dialogues. That's one thing which this division can further fuel the outcome. And the other is actually, as I mentioned, the procedural arrangement. They have their own preferences. They have their own ways of and approaches to deal with the decision-making structures. So there should be consensus also on the procedural arrangement of the talks, which until and unless this political leaders will not have consensus on the procedural arrangement of the talks and the substantive issues, I don't think that the talks will have any positive result. And I don't think even the talks could happen substantively. So yes, my take is the division and the divide between President Ghani and Dr. Abdullah could seriously impact both the process and the result of intra-Afghan talks, and both in terms of the procedural arrangement of decision-making and in terms of substantive issues that has to be discussed and to come to a conclusion at this point.
I would add just a couple of words to that. I fully agree with what Niloufar said. And just to add, I think the problems that are likely to exist on the Kabul negotiating team, the problem of determining how will it make decisions, who gets to give political guidance. It's 21 people representing different factions and interests and groups. Is it one person, one vote in that 21 group body? Is it consensus? Crucial questions that go well beyond just how many seats does each person or each faction or group have at the table. Those problems existed before the dispute between Ghani and Abdullah and apart from that dispute. But that dispute makes it more acute, unquestionably. If that dispute is resolved between Ghani and Abdullah over the issue of the presidency, and if some arrangement is made, I think you'll still have these same problems that Niloufar outlined. It's just that it might be somewhat more amenable to resolution. And then, that aside, even if you do overcome through struggle throughout the process, these kinds of disagreements, both substantive and procedural, and you come up with a way for forming consensus, it seems unquestionable to me that political unity is negotiating strength. Political disunity is negotiating weakness.
Well, thank you. Osami, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I wanted to add some points to that. I think I agree with Niloufar and Laurel that it is already impacting the peace process. And as we saw, Secretary Pompeo came to Kabul to resolve this issue between President Ghani and Abdullah, because if they do not agree, we cannot form a meaningful team to negotiate the process with the Taliban. Because in this process, I think in the eyes of so many observers, Dr. Abdullah is representing those groups who have been fighting against the Taliban historically since 1990s. So without him and without the groups that he represents, a meaningful presence of these groups in the negotiations team, I think we cannot um, foresee a meaningful peace in Afghanistan, because the main groups who are fighting for the past 25 years are the Taliban and those groups who were previously named as the Northern Alliance. That's one thing. The other thing is, I think the opportunity for peace and negotiations should be used to resolve issues and problems, some fundamental problems in Afghanistan, which go beyond the war and the conflict. I think the conflict is, as Niloufar mentioned, about the structure of power sharing in this country. If that is not addressed in our constitution, and if that is not addressed in the negotiations with the Taliban, as unfortunately we didn't address it during the Bonn conference, I think we are going to enter into another cycle of conflict. And we will see new players and new groups emerging and fighting for something. The second thing is the fundamental rights should be addressed during these negotiations, like women's rights, human rights, minorities' rights. Taliban have had their point of view and their stance for almost 25 years now about these issues. They interpret everything through the lens of the Sharia and the way they interpret Sharia. So I think a big part of the conflict in Afghanistan in the last 25 years has been on the how to interpret and how to translate the Sharia codes and laws. I think the current negotiations team, which is kind of broad-based and includes almost a lot of different factions and groups from Kabul, but at the same time, we still do not understand what this delegation stands for. What are the core issues that they are going to negotiate with the Taliban? We understand the point of views of some of the members, but are they negotiating under one umbrella? Because we have some people inside this group who ideologically are more closer to the Taliban. If you see compared to their distance with the government and other members of the negotiations team. So that's a major problem, and unless the crisis between Abdullah and Ghani is resolved, I don't think that the delegation will have an umbrella and an agenda which everyone agrees, and they are going with a strong stance, sitting across the table with the Taliban and negotiating on behalf of the Afghan population.
Well, thank you. Thank you for those interesting comments from all of you. The questions are starting to pour in from our audience. Going to get to those in a moment, but just one question. I actually wanted to pose this to Ashley to bring her into the conversation. The Taliban, of course, rejected this negotiating team list put together by Kabul. Why do you think the Taliban rejected it? I mean, is it an effort to try to exploit these divisions within the Afghan government and the political class that we've been talking about, or is it something else?
Yeah, I mean, I read that as pretty typical. I didn't feel it was a rejection in the sense of we will not sit down with this negotiating team because of its composition. I read that as posturing, as bluster, and that's just my interpretation. I think blowing it out of proportion as well, to say that, they weren't saying they wouldn't engage in intra-Afghan talks because this team had been proposed. So I think it's really important with Taliban statements to keep them, in the proportion, in the sort of context in which they're made, which is a armed insurgency that throws a lot of rocks through its website, through Twitter, and I wouldn't have expected them to say anything else. I thought the Afghan government's response was interesting as well, as sort of saying, you know, how inclusive will you be? Basically, you know that the Taliban team is going to be pretty monolithic in many respects, right? But even that, I think the fact that the Taliban is acknowledging it, is responding to it, can be seen in almost a positive light. They're engaging with this development, right? And that's, I would take the positive from that. But going back to your point about divide and rule, and this is something that I thought about during Laurel's comments and the response to the preceding discussion, is that that's exactly what the Taliban has done, is divide and rule in divided communities throughout the countryside. That's where they found traction. They have tried to play politics in many other ways. And certainly what they want is to have a government in which they'll share power, or they'll include certain factions, right? That's what they want. And that's sort of come through in their statements, if not overtly, then subtly. They don't want to sit down with a unified negotiating team because they want power and they want to share power as they see fit. So it's an absolute disaster that you don't have a government negotiating team that is unified, that is strong, that is on the same page, that has a clear and unified agenda. And all these questions around what will the structure be, what will the mechanism be, add to this lack of clarity and mean that, you know, every little decision risks being held hostage to political plays on both sides in a way.
Well, thank you for that, Ashley. Let's get to a question from one of our members of the audience. And this actually, I think, is a good question because it sort of follows up on a point that one of you made. Maybe it was you, Ashley, about this idea of some type of humanitarian dialogue tied to the coronavirus crisis. The question is, does the impending COVID health crisis present the government of Afghanistan with a strategic opportunity to seize the moral high ground by reaching out to the Taliban to establish a joint prevention/response commission? And if so, what might that look like? Anyone want to address that?
I would just say I'm doubtful that the Taliban would accept that. So I suppose there's some tactical opportunity in reaching out, knowing that the Taliban will reject it, and therefore allowing the government to assert some higher ground. But I don't think it, I mean, that's not a wrong thing to do. I just don't know that that actually moves forward either the COVID response or the peace process.
Well, I wanted to add some points to that. The government has been very active in responding to the COVID-19. And actually, from the very beginning of the spread of COVID-19 inside Afghanistan, the Afghan government asked the Taliban for a ceasefire again, and they rejected. And the Taliban, I think they have been trying to use the opportunity and say, to show that they care for humanitarian issues, and they have established their own sort of groups who are fighting against the COVID-19. But I think the real opportunity will be if the Taliban, I mean, what the Taliban can do really is to agree to a ceasefire during the COVID-19, because it is affecting the entire country, and the poor people are affected more, especially people who live in the villages where we don't have much medical facilities, healthcare. So if the Taliban really wanted to help the people, they should stop the fighting and at least agree to some sort of ceasefire at this moment.
Maybe I can just add one thing quickly. I mean, there's a terrible irony in all of this, is that with previous pandemics in other wars, obviously they affect combatants more in many cases because they're in tight quarters, you know, for lots of reasons. So ultimately, you know, the Taliban fighters, as well as the Afghan national security forces will probably be unduly affected by this. I would not see a sort of public relations exercise, a sort of joint commission or something high profile, as being the way forward on any humanitarian collaboration. I think what you could see is something mediated by a third party, let's say the UN or WHO, that gets both sides to agree to common measures, or has the Taliban playing its part in enforcing a lockdown or a quarantine. Obviously, the way the Taliban health system works is that it co-ops the government health system, which is primarily implemented by NGOs. So there's already a level of cooperation and coordination, to put it benignly. Of course, the Taliban's co-opting and exploiting the health system for their own political and military objectives. But at least there is that kind of dialogue, which would be, something to build on, right? So there is an opportunity there, but I don't, as Laurel said, I think that's right. It's not a high-profile joint task force kind of situation. I think it could be something that could be mediated by an intermediary such as the UN, or a more technical WHO, something like that, where you have some opportunity for dialogue and collaboration. But I wouldn't want to overplay it into something like that, whatever opportunity does in fact exist.
Well, thank you. So the point that Laurel had made earlier, recommending that the U.S. get behind the appointment of a neutral mediator in this story, has sparked a very large number of questions. And so basically the thrust of the questions are, could you elaborate a bit more on what you mean by that? And specifically, what countries would be the most credible, reasonable to get involved in some type of one country mediation process or multiple? And I think broadly speaking, I was going to ask a question about the regional story here. I think it is important for us to talk a bit more about the neighborhood. There have been some comments about this earlier, but maybe Laurel and also Nilüfer, I want to get your views on this as well, because I know that you look at the regional outlook here. What should the key countries be doing now? Pakistan is a key player that we haven't really discussed yet. It played a major role, it played a key facilitating role in the U.S. Taliban talks. What role should be envisioned for Pakistan here moving forward? I think Iran is a very important player to look at as well, and China and Russia. That's a lot to digest, and we have many other questions. But maybe, Laurel, if you wanted to first start off just by responding to the question about if you could get into a bit more what you mean about this idea of a neutral mediator, what countries would be best for it, and then maybe Nilüfer could step in with some comments more broadly about what regional players should be doing.
Mm-hmm. What's most important is not the country or organization backing the person, it's who the person is. An effective mediator needs to be someone who has a stature that will be respected by the parties internally and externally, someone who can interact at the highest levels with the parties, not just at a technical level, and not only with the people who are present in the negotiations, but with their political masters as well, and someone who can engage with the regional countries and the United States at the highest levels, and also someone who's an effective, experienced negotiator. I mean, there are people out there who can do that. It's not so hard to come up with names. It's obviously ideal that such a person be of a nationality, that they're from a country that is not regarded as biased in the process. I mean, I wouldn't choose a Pakistani for this role. There are other countries I would exclude from this role. I wouldn't choose an American for this role. That person can then be backed in terms of the mechanics of the process by a government that has experience in establishing secretariat kind of functions for and more technical facilitating functions for peace processes. There are several governments who qualify for that. I think it would be useful to have a UN hat for this person, either through an explicit endorsement from the Security Council or the UN Secretary General giving some kind of personal mandate to the person, but that doesn't make this a UN function per se. I would not choose someone from within the UN system who is more of a technocratic individual to fill this role. In terms of what the person can do, this is a person who can help to set a structure for the process by talking to the parties on all sides, getting their views, then making proposals on the structure. It's someone who can help set the agenda for the process by talking separately to the two sides and then making proposals as to what the agenda and sequence of agenda items should be. It's someone who can bring in expertise on peace process management from technical experts from around the world, who can respond to individual requests from the parties for neutral technical expertise by linking them up with people. Very importantly, it's someone who can engage in what are called proximity talks, where you don't have all the negotiators in the room all the time. You have, especially at moments where you're addressing very difficult issues, a mediator can talk to one side, then talk to the other side, and then put forward compromise proposals for both sides to consider. In a peace process, you also have to have someone who does what's called managing the paper, someone who holds the pen, as diplomats say, someone who takes the proposals of the sides and actually manages the process of various iterations of whatever is agreed, and who's trusted by the two sides to make sure that technically it's done in a neutral way, that translations are not sneaking things in. I mean, these sound like small things, but I have firsthand seen these come up in other peace negotiations where if there's a lot of distrust, I mean, no one on the Taliban side is going to trust a government secretariat to manage the technical process of producing the paper, and vice versa. And so those are the kinds of things that a mediator also can manage, especially with the COVID situation and the difficulties that may be presented by meeting all together. Someone who can do virtual proximity talks, there may be a particular advantage to that at this time. So those are just some examples. There are others as well. I'll leave it to Niloufar and others to comment on the regional perspective. I'll just say the crucial role for Pakistan, for Iran, for China, for Russia, for others, is going to be, if this process starts to gain traction, pressing the parties on both sides to stick with it and to compromise. That leverage is going to be needed to be exerted on all parties if this is ever going to produce a result.
Well, thank you. Niloufar, would you like to weigh in on the regional story or weigh in a bit more on the regional players?
Yeah, sure. Just in addition to what Laura said about the mediator, I think one of the important thing about the independent mediator is that it should be recognized by the parties in Afghanistan. So this is another issue that why if Ghani and Abdullah team are not coming together, I think they will have certainly conflict over any independent mediator who will be hired from outside to take the issue forward. So that's another point to be added in terms of their agreement and disagreement over independent mediator, which is a pretty good idea. I have categorized actually the peace process of Afghanistan into three levels. The first level was United States-Taliban deal, which happened, and many perceived that as an exit strategy, and many perceived that as a facilitating agreement to take the peace process forward. And the other aspect is the intra-Afghan talks, which we are in the process, not sure where it's going to happen. And the third element of the peace process is the regional peace process. And the regional piece is, I think it's connected to the two first and second level that I discussed. The regional aspect, we have Cambodia example that the regional countries come together and they talk about their interest and also the regional interest, and then how that could impact conflict and peace in a particular country. The Cambodia case was a failure, again, from IR perspective. But again, I would envision that something like that could happen regionally in case of Afghanistan peace. Pakistan has been opportunistic every time in case of Afghanistan. It's not a reliable partner because of certain evidence we had in the past. It has been a good business for them from last decades. They treat Afghanistan case as the business, and as they have a political strategy deeply involved there that they implement as well. So looking at Pakistan as an alternative, I think it's a mistake. Pakistan cannot take this Afghan peace process forward. It can't be a reliable partner in the process, and also a neutral partner in the process. Can never be that. As Laura has mentioned, it's not a good idea to move with them. Iran has its own interest. They are actually the primary parties in conflict. They are the neighboring the border countries, neighboring states, and they have been historically involved in conflict peace in Afghanistan. They have their interest in Afghanistan. They have economic interests, political interests. So they cannot be a reliable partner in terms of neutral position by promoting peace in Afghanistan. So, but that said, excluding them from the process again is a mistake. And I think many of us, since the beginning of this peace talks in September 2018, have been focusing that bring these countries all together at the table of negotiations. Not only ad hoc meetings, actually bringing all of them at one table and discuss the interests. That shows the comprehensiveness. Russia is there. Russia expansion in the region, its interest on Afghanistan is still there. We have seen back and forth their statements and the peace and conflict processes in Afghanistan. So this partners, the ad hoc meetings, secret meetings with them, okay, that could be back channeling mediation, which has happened already through Ambassador Khalilzad, which seems to be a good process. On the other hand, there should be really a comprehensive plan to bring them at the one table. I am not sure in terms of Iran how realistic it is, but if US won't be a direct mediator, I think Iran can also be brought at the table. Because Iran might not right now support or totally involved in the process because of US engagement. But if US won't be a direct mediator, or if, according to Laurel, if we have an independent non-US mediator in the process, I think all countries can be brought at one table to discuss the interest. And for me, I still think that unless and until this country's interests are not taken into consideration, we will not expect a sustainable peace in Afghanistan. They will have their meddling, they still have their proxies, and they benefit from both from conflict and from war. So their interest to be taken into serious consideration. Any peace deal is an important element to take it forward, especially with the new changes in the region that we have seen in the past.
Well, thank you very much. There are a number of questions about the Taliban, and I'm going to consolidate them, and maybe I'll throw these to you, Ashley. It's really two questions, and others, of course, can weigh in as well. The first one is a very immediate term question, and that's, have you seen any evaluations of the Taliban's activities on COVID, combating COVID in the areas that are controlled by the Taliban? And the second question is much more broadly. It sort of is the question of what does the Taliban really want question, which of course is the question that we're all trying to pose. What type of power sharing deal, if any, would the Taliban be receptive to? Would it want to hold on to the territory that it holds? Would it want to be given control of the federal ministry? What would work for the Taliban? So broad questions, but first of all, any indication of how they're handling the coronavirus issue in areas they control, and then more broadly, what would they potentially want in a peace process, in a political settlement, if that process were to begin?
Yeah, one of those is easy and one of those is incredibly hard to answer. So I will start, as you suggested, with the easy one. I mean, I've been talking to friends in Herat, and I was in Herat this time last year, of course. I mean, Herat to me is very surprising. It's been many years since I'd been there. It's almost entirely controlled by the Taliban. You leave the airport and you drive 20 minutes in the wrong direction and you see the Taliban white flags. So the Taliban has a huge presence in this province, which is one of the epicenters, at least, of the COVID pandemic in Afghanistan. And so talking to friends who live there and some of the people I've worked with over the years, and they say the Taliban has tried to enforce quarantines of people returning from Herat. They've announced this publicly, but this is anecdotal evidence that they're trying to do some of the containment. And if there's one thing that the Taliban is very good at, is authoritarian kind of measures. So people seem to be, in some of the districts where I've talked to people, seem to be complying with that. But are they doctors? Are they actually skilled to be able to deal with this? No, right, of course. And Herat and other places, the real problem is you have a very poor quality health infrastructure, and I think that's the real problem. So beyond evaluating what the Taliban is or isn't doing, I think it's about evaluating what the NGOs that comprise the bulk of the Afghan public health system, I mean, what capacity do they really have to do things to treat people, rather than the Taliban just enforcing sort of the kinds of measures we're all subject to right now. Which, just to say, there is an indication that they are trying to do some of that stuff. On what they really want, they've been very smart to be very vague, right, about what they really want. It's very difficult in reading the Taliban statements and policies, to understand what they see as the end state that they want to achieve. There are hints at it. The use of the word emirate hints at what kind of structure they might want. But then in meetings going back, a decade to Chantilly in Tokyo, they've been more open. They, maybe an emirate could be something that incorporates a constitution, for example. So I think there are hints at what they want, but they've been clever not to state their position in a way that's absolutely clear. Because if they do, not only will there be immediate objections from the other sides in this conflict, but there'll also be dissension within their ranks. The Taliban is an incredibly diverse movement. Issues like girls' education, the structure of government, any of the issues that we're wondering about are intensively debated within at least the leadership, if not amongst some of the rank and file. So some things are clear, right? They want a Sharia justice system. Can that coexist with elements of the justice system that you have now, which, let's not forget, the current Afghan justice system in part incorporates Sharia. So there are some commonalities, particularly with family law, for example. What kind of, executive would they agree to? Well, we don't know that. So I think we know parts of what they would desire. We don't know what they're willing to compromise on, and we don't really know what their hard red lines are. And I think part of that is this strategic ambiguity, but part of it is because there are different ideas within the movement about, what exactly would be acceptable, what exactly would be unacceptable. So I don't think I've shed much light on the question of what they want, simply because they've been clever to keep it quite vague.
Could I just add a word to that, Michael, just to say, I think it is important to, I agree with what Ashley said, but I would add that I think it's important to bear in mind, first of all, in any peace process, the positions of the negotiating parties evolve during the peace process. Obviously, it would be better if the Taliban entered into this process, and same true on the other side, with fully formed goals and positions that they're negotiating toward. But this is one of the reasons why it's important to expect a process to take some time and to be patient, because this will only work if there is space permitted for that evolution of positions. And then there's the second thing I would say is that I think, what Ashley outlined does point to why this is going to be a very difficult peace process, and frankly, why it may fail. I mean, the Taliban may, aside from other problems that could intervene, the Taliban may decide that reaching compromises is too divisive for their group and that they're not going to do it. I'm not predicting that. I'm just saying that, you know, these are reasons to be cautious about what the prospects for the process are. However, the whole point of the peace process is to test the proposition that the sides can develop positions and that enough common ground can be found between those positions to produce a result. And so I think it's, I would advise strongly against making any judgments at the outset about the feasibility of a peace process producing a result because of these kinds of problems. Because the purpose of the process is to test the proposition that it may be possible. If we knew at the outset it was possible, this would be much easier, and you probably wouldn't need a peace process at all. But you know, every peace process of any level of difficulty, and most of them are difficult, do not look guaranteed to be successful at any day other than the, you know, the day of signature.
Well, thank you for that, Laurel. We've got 10 minutes left, and I want to pose one question about the internal politics in Kabul, and then a few questions about U.S. policy. So, Sami, why don't I pose this question to you, and that is, the questioner says, I have heard some Afghan leaders are trying to start a dialogue between President Ghani and Abdullah. What is this dialogue about? What is the ultimate outcome they're looking at? And what are the Abdullah and Ghani factor? How do Abdullah and Ghani factor into this outcome in terms of their political futures? Did you want to address that?
Well, I think it's about power sharing, in short. So they want to share power, but at the beginning, I mean, I should say that President Ghani asked Dr. Abdullah to accept the results of the elections, the presidential elections, and introduce some of his followers and his political team members as members of the cabinet, and accept the role, an important role in the negotiations with the Taliban. That's what has been the President Ghani's position in the last 2-3 weeks. But Dr. Abdullah is saying he does not accept the results of the elections, and he is saying President Ghani should either accept presidency with 40% of the cabinet, or prime ministership with 60% of the cabinet. So that's the deal that Dr. Abdullah has been trying to push for. But to begin that deal, first of all, Dr. Abdullah is asking that the results should be delegitimized, and he doesn't accept the results of elections. So it's all about the power sharing, as I mentioned at the beginning of this session. Former President Karzai, Sayyaf, Karim Khalili, and Qanuni, they are trying to mediate between Ghani and Abdullah. Today, the former chief of staff of President Karzai told Radio Free Europe, Radio Azadi in Kabul, that from the negotiations they had last night, there are some positive changes, but he didn't make it clear what are those steps and what are the changes. Anyway, it looks like Secretary Pompeo is still pushing for an inclusive government between Dr. Abdullah and Dr. Ghani, because after the formation of the peace negotiations delegation by President Ghani, Secretary Pompeo tweeted it and said that he welcomes and he urged both sides to create an inclusive government.
Just in addition of what Sami said, I think there should be sequencing of the process now at this stage. The division between these political leaders could really harm the process. Therefore, I think first the whole focus should be on resolving this particular political crisis in order to bring them together, because then I'm afraid that if the intra-Afghan peace negotiation starts, the other party will become a spoiler in the process. So that's one of the threat that we can see in upcoming intra-Afghan dialogue if it starts. So I think the sequencing is important at this stage, and it's important to first deal with this Kabul political crisis, bring these parties together, or sort out a settlement in order for them to have a consensus on the peace process. Until again, I'm afraid that there will be a creator of another spoiler in the process.
Well, thank you very much.
I wanted to add, if we have time, one more point, that as Niloufar said, if the differences are not resolved before entering the negotiations with the Taliban, I think some members of the negotiations team would ask for reforms in the constitution, which Taliban are also asking for the reforms in the constitution. So the team from there will split at least in two sides. One side who is more closer to President Ghani and will emphasize on keeping the current constitution. And the other side who is closer to Dr. Abdullah and represents to some extent his political views, they will ask for a reform in the constitution, because they are asking for a different kind of power sharing and different kind of political structure for the government.
Well, thank you. With just a very few moments left, I wanted to pose one question, which is a tough question, but I think an important one. And I would invite several of you to weigh in, if you'd like, with a very brief response. And it gets back to the issue of U.S. policy. What do you think are the conditions of what U.S. officials call the new, quote, conditions-based withdrawal of U.S. and international forces? Can you envision any scenario under which the U.S. actually halts the withdrawal of troops as outlined in the U.S.-Taliban agreement? And of course, there's been a criticism that the U.S.-Taliban agreement goes easy on the Taliban. It makes it very difficult for the U.S. to actually halt the withdrawal, just because of an expectation that it wouldn't take much for the Taliban to uphold the commitments it's been asked to make. So anyway, if anyone wants to address that question, it's a very interesting one.
I can start, and I can be short about it. The conditions are whatever the U.S. makes up along the way. I mean, the agreement has left the U.S. enormous latitude to decide what the conditions really are as it goes along. The only thing that the agreement requires is that the Taliban abide by their commitments on the anti-terrorism provisions. But how is that measured? Who says? What information? I mean, it's all left to, I'm sure from the US perspective at least, it's all left to the US judgment as to what is sufficient compliance, and particularly because the kinds of things that the Taliban has been obligated to do are really in the vein of not doing things, not actually doing things. I mean, it doesn't require them to, capture and kill foreign elements in Afghanistan. It only requires them to prevent certain things from taking place and to issue instructions to their followers and others along those lines. Now, whether you see this as a good thing or a bad thing depends on your perspective. If you think that, in fact, the kind of conditionality there should be is more linked to the peace process and not only about Taliban compliance with these provisions, then you might think, okay, this flexibility gives the US some room to impose kind of implicit conditions. If you think the US really should be getting out and that any Taliban perception that the US is not abiding by the 14-month timeline is going to lead to a worsening of the situation, then you might see this flexibility as a negative. But I think what's unquestionable is that it's left a tremendous amount of flexibility for interpretation in US hands.
Anyone else very quickly want to make a 30-second comment?
Yeah, I mean, I would just very much agree with Laurel. I was having a conversation with a friend, sort of trying to see, because violence has gone back up so much, trying to estimate, okay, well, if they took a mid-sized provincial capital, would the US then, would that challenge the deal? I don't think it would. I think, again, it's linked to whatever the US in that particular political moment decides the conditions will be, which is both, I mean, as Laurel points out, both worrisome and also, creates a fairly resilient framework to keep the US on track to achieve its goal of getting out. But again, I mean, that's how I read that deal. The goal is to get out, and secondarily to support an intra-Afghan peace process. So yeah, I mean, I think it is anyone's guess, and it would be foolish to foretell what precisely that might be that triggers the US, if anything happens, to trigger the US to reverse its plans. But again, I mean, who could have predicted the tweet that came last September? So anything could honestly happen.
Well, thank you very much. Unfortunately, our time is up. I have to say these 90 minutes flew by. Thank you for all of you for submitting your questions. I'm sorry that I couldn't get to all of your questions. This has been a terrific discussion. It's been a difficult discussion because it's a difficult topic. I think that now is the right time to be having these conversations because there does seem to be a bit of movement, some things happening on the ground, but clearly, as all of our panelists have described this morning, it's just going to be a very difficult, long, hard slog. And of course, these negotiations take time. If there's anything we could learn from similar negotiations, you can't get these things to happen. You can't get deals in a matter of days or weeks or even years, even months. It takes a number of years. So wanted to thank our 4 panelists for joining us. I wanted to thank all of you for listening. This has been great. And I would also like to just hope that everyone, please stay well and safe and healthy.
And wash your hands.
And wash your hands for 20 seconds, indeed. But thanks again.
If you can, wash your hands.
Indeed, absolutely. Thank you very much. And I should say finally that we will have this this conversation uploaded on the Wilson Center website so that it can be seen later as well. So again, thank you all, and we are adjourned.
Thanks, Michael.
Thank you, Michael.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.